NASA's coolest space science mission that humans got to be a part of. Well, it's no doubt it's the Apollo missions. You see, these were the ones where we actually sent astronauts to the moon, which was and still is a huge deal in our history. Imagine this. Before Apollo, folks weren't entirely convinced that the moon wasn't just a big cheese wheel floating in the sky. Yes, some people used to think the moon was made of cheese. So our brave astronauts went up close and personal with the moon and brought back moon rocks. These souvenirs turned out to be a gold mine of information. By examining those moon rocks, scientists learned some amazing things. They figured out how old the moon really is, what it's actually made of, and even got some clues about how it all began. So thanks to the Apollo missions, we got to unravel some of the moon's biggest mysteries and expand our cosmic knowledge. Apollo 13 was all set to be the third time we were going to land on the moon. Super exciting stuff, right? But hold on to your space helmets, because things took a twist. There was a hiccup. The oxygen tank in the service module went pop, like a cosmic soda can, and the whole lunar landing plan had to be scratched. Now here's where it gets interesting. Even though the mission didn't go as planned, it wasn't a total bust. In fact, it earned itself the title of a successful failure. Why? Well, turns out the astronauts and the folks at NASA learned a ton from this unexpected turn of events. They had to pull off a daring rescue mission to bring the crew back safely, which was like a real-life space adventure. Oh, and guess what? Despite all the drama, the rocket's upper stage didn't waste its trip. It made a grand exit by crashing into the moon like a cosmic farewell. So Apollo 13 might not have landed where it aimed, but it sure left a mark up there. So let's take a look at what went down. This is a nail-biting adventure for sure. Back in the 1960s, the Soviets were totally winning the space race. They sent a dog, and even a dude named Yuri Gagarin, to space before anyone else. But U.S. President John F. Kennedy wasn't going to let them have all the glory. He threw down the ultimate challenge. Let's put a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And guess what? They actually did it. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first brave ones to show us how it's done.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man.
Fast forward to the Apollo 13 mission. NASA said this time, we want to explore the super rugged area on the moon called Fra Muro. Why was this spot so special? Because it was caused by a massive asteroid smash. It was too cool to ignore. So this was their mission setup: a cone-shaped command module where the astronauts chilled, a spidery lunar module to take 2 guys to the moon, and a big cylindrical service module with engines and oxygen tanks. Here's the plan. The service module would orbit the moon and meet up with a capsule that the lunar module would blast off after they finished their moonwalk. Everything was going to be controlled by 2 guidance computers on board, one in the command module and the other in the lunar module. All right, now let's meet the crew of Apollo 13. We got James Lovell, the mission commander, a seasoned pro and a family guy. There's Jack Swigert, who hopped in at the last minute because another astronaut caught the measles. And last but not least, Haise, a rookie who left his wife and 3 kids on Earth. Now, when Apollo 13 took off on April 11, 1970, nobody was really paying attention.
1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. Saturn V, building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
It's like nobody cared. But little did they know that within 10 minutes of a broadcast showing the crew floating through space, something crazy would happen that would grab the attention of the whole world. But for now, things were going pretty smooth. These guys were zooming through space at a mind-boggling 40,000 kilometers per hour. They needed to pull a sweet 180-degree turn to dock the lunar module and ditch the used-up rocket. Yep, they were well on their way to the moon, my friend. Everything was going smoothly. And we're bored to tears down here, said Joe, the guy in charge of communication, at the 46-hour mark. Little did the crew know that just a few meters beneath them, there were some cracked wires next to a seriously flammable oxygen tank. After 55 hours and 46 minutes, the crew finished a TV broadcast where Fred couldn't resist pulling a bunch of practical jokes. His favorite way to mess with the crew was with the repressurization valve, which made this crazy, loud banging noise, but all was well. But what happened next was going to change history. At around the 322,000 kilometer mark, Jack turned on the fans near the oxygen tanks in the service module. Bad move. Turns out those cracked wires were exposed and boom! Tank number 2 exploded, scaring the living daylights out of all of them. They all looked at each other, thinking it was Fred's prank again. But even he was stunned this time. Suddenly, the alarm light goes crazy, and this warning about an electrical power failure appears. At that moment, they knew that things were about to get serious. Nothing was boring from that point on. Mission Commander James Lovell famously announced to Mission Control, "Houston, we have a problem." And they couldn't believe their eyes down on Earth.
Hey, Houston, we've had a problem here. Oh, you're begging, please.
I was on the lunar
Oh, Houston, we've had a problem.
It was plagued by bad omens and bad luck from the very beginning.
The warning lights were going crazy, showing that 2 out of 3 fuel cells had conked out. And to top it off, one oxygen tank was completely empty, and the other one was running out fast. Mission Control engineers were in a frenzy, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. I mean, seriously, so many failures all at once? That's like a cosmic conspiracy. These many failures could mean that the crew could end up dead. Even Lovell realized that it was way trickier than he had imagined. To make matters worse, the catastrophic failures were confirmed in no time, and it was downright terrifying. Because when Lovell glanced out the window, he saw oxygen leaking out of the second oxygen tank, the only remaining oxygen tank at this moment. That was bad news for everyone. Just imagine looking out the window mid-flight and seeing the engine on fire. That was what it was like. Yikes. The crew knew they were in a tight spot, but you know what? They didn't lose their cool. They understood that freaking out wouldn't do any good. These guys were true heroes, keeping their heads held high in the face of danger. With the oxygen and fuel disappearing, things went from bad to worse. The crew found themselves without electricity, light, or water. They were basically stranded 200,000 miles away from Earth. And guess what? They were going in the wrong direction. Forget about landing on the moon. That's out of the question now. The top priority was to correct their trajectory. The explosion had thrown them off course, and if they didn't fix it, they would swing around the moon during their return journey and miss the Earth completely. It was like a suspenseful space movie playing out in real life. With the whole world's eyes glued to the unfolding situation, the ground engineers assessed the situation. About an hour and 29 seconds after the explosion, when the service module was too damaged to provide any thrust, they decided that the crew should use the lunar module as a lifeboat. But it wasn't going to be a cakewalk. They had to sort out oxygen, power, food, and water dilemmas in the lunar module. Plus, the journey home, a head-scratcher. They had to turn off most of the systems in the command module, except for the really important ones, to save power. This move would make it super cold inside the spacecraft, even colder than freezing. The tricky part was that they weren't sure if the guidance instruments could handle that extreme cold temperature. Hold your breath. They had a mere 15 minutes of power and oxygen left in the damaged module. Time was of the essence. They had to move to the lunar module as soon as possible. Thankfully, all made it to the lunar module, and there was spare oxygen. Crisis averted, but it wasn't a forever fix. Imagine this. Crammed in the lunar module, they tiptoed to conserve oxygen. One wrong move could mean lights out for everyone. That's how flimsy the lunar module was. They were wondering how much longer the spacecraft could keep 3 people alive instead of its usual 2, which was its original design. The experts back on Earth crunched the numbers, estimating the lunar module could shelter 3 for 2 days. Not too shabby. They had a lifeline, but the epic challenge remained: how to safely get them back home. The astronauts had 2 choices: use the main engine to rush back to Earth, risking engine failure, or take a slower route around the Moon using its gravity to help. They picked the second option despite challenges. They decided to use the Moon's gravity to their advantage. By doing that, they could potentially add an extra 1 or 2 days to their journey and slingshot themselves back toward the Earth. They had to use the lunar module's rocket, which was not meant for the job, and with the command module still attached, the center of gravity was messed up, so it was near impossible to navigate this. Imagine trying to steer left, but going up instead. They did a 35-second rocket burn for speed, but were worried they'd run out of power and water. Their onboard computer was so weak that all complex math was done on Earth and radioed to them. They followed instructions precisely, even when out of radio contact behind the Moon. They hoped a 5-minute burn would reduce the trip by 24 hours, but it might not be enough. They had no other option but to give it a try. Their lives depended on this. In order to save power, they turned off most systems and floated toward Earth for 3 days. With just the guidance system on, temperatures went below freezing. Water was scarce, and they had to store waste instead of ejecting it, which was tricky. They drank less, got cold, dehydrated, and tired. The conditions were worse, so much so that Fred got sick, but others helped him stay warm. Real teamwork in tough times. By this time, everyone around the world was glued to updates about Apollo 13. It was a gripping adventure that had people from every corner hooked. Countries offered to help. Prayers poured in, and everyone watched anxiously as this daring journey unfolded. It was a one-of-a-kind adventure that wouldn't be matched for years. Things got even tougher. The 3 astronauts were making too much carbon dioxide, risking suffocation. The lunar module's filters were running out while the command module had extras. The hitch? The filter shapes didn't match. So they had to get clever. Imagine the puzzle: square canisters and round spaces in the lunar module. They had to figure out how to fit a square peg into a round hole. With at least 2 more days of travel ahead, they had to find a fix. Mission Control could only give prototypes. The actual thing had to be made by the crew, following ground instructions. Describing it was hard enough, but luckily they built it using plastic bags, cardboard, and duct tape. Talk about thinking on their feet. Even after tackling power, water, food, and excess carbon dioxide, the biggest hurdle was left: getting back to Earth. They planned to land in the Pacific, but could land hundreds of miles off target. Re-entry was tricky. They had to turn off their guidance system and manually adjust, centering the Earth in their window and crossing their fingers. So nerve-wracking. The last challenge was moving to the frozen command module and powering up before heading to Earth. This needed new methods, which usually take months to create. But the ground team, led by Flight Director Gene Kranz, managed it in just 3 days. They were under pressure, crunching crucial numbers and performing life-saving engineering. Every calculation had to be perfect. With 9 hours left before re-entry, they were zooming through space at a mind-boggling speed of 32,000 kilometers per hour. That's 20,000 miles per hour. The crew scrambled to write down instructions on any scraps of paper they could find on board. It took them over 2 hours to jot everything down. As the crew flipped the switches to power up the command module, everything sprang to life. That was a relief. Despite enduring freezing temperatures far beyond what they were designed for, the components held up. Now it was time to eject the service module. As it drifted away, the full extent of the disaster was revealed. The entire side was blown off in the explosion. Now there was a new concern. There was a possibility that the heat shield had been damaged in the explosion. If it had any flaws, they could burn up during re-entry. But the crew couldn't dwell on that right now. They had a more immediate task: jettisoning their lunar module lifeboat. It was time for re-entry. The spacecraft plunged into the Earth's atmosphere, turning into a glowing orb in the sky. As expected, there was supposed to be a 3-minute communications blackout during this phase. However, when those 3 minutes passed, and the blackout persisted, anxiety gripped everyone monitoring the situation on Earth. It seemed like the crew might have perished during re-entry. But then, out of the blue, the words, "Okay, Joe," were heard.
Can we get 2
Roger that.
A wave of relief washed over everyone. Once they cleared the atmosphere, the crew successfully deployed their parachutes. They had done it. A tremendous sigh of relief resonated around the world. Finally, on April 17th, after enduring a perilous journey lasting 142 hours, 54 minutes, and 41 seconds, the crew splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. All 3 astronauts made it home safely, and 1,000,000 prayers from people around the globe had been answered. It was a moment of triumph and gratitude. The story doesn't end there. Now we have to find out what went wrong. The Apollo 13 Accident Review Board did their thing and found the culprit: a short circuit. It turned out that when they had modified fuel tank number 1 for the Apollo 13 mission, they raised the voltage to the heaters in the oxygen tanks from 28 volts to 65 volts DC. But they forgot to modify the thermostatic switches on the heaters to handle the charge. To make matters worse, during the final test on the launch pad, the Teflon insulation on the tank was damaged, which created a risk of a short circuit. And we all know what happened next: the explosion that rocked the whole mission. Now, here's a cool fact. The command module, which survived the ordeal, is actually kept at the Kansas Cosmosphere and Space Center in Kansas. It's like a little piece of space history right here on Earth. As for the lunar module, well, it's believed to have burned up in the Earth's atmosphere. Farewell, little lunar module. Even though the crew of Apollo 13 didn't get the chance to set foot on the moon, their mission is still called a successful failure, because NASA managed to bring the entire crew back home safely, even with a damaged spacecraft. Talk about a wild ride. And guess what? Mission Commander James Lovell became the first person to travel to the moon not once, but twice. Now that's an impressive record. Apollo 13 taught NASA some valuable lessons in engineering and spacecraft design. It paved the way for future successful missions. It's a story that showcases the incredible brilliance of engineers and their ability to think on their feet. Bringing 3 brave astronauts back home from a whopping 200,000 miles out in space, that's a tale for the ages. NASA's main gig is exploring the universe. It's not easy stuff. Sending humans into space and bringing them back safely is super challenging. It's a risky business, but NASA's up for the challenge. What do you think about the Apollo missions, and specifically this Apollo 13 mission? After hearing this story, would you want to travel to space? Let us know in the comments, and let's chat about it. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to Bistory for more adventures.